The mother, who's a flamboyant California biker with an affinity for who bravely raises her little son, Rocky, a little boy with a rare disease that eventually distorts his face into a cruel mask of deformity.
She was supposed to be grateful. That was the script Hollywood had written for her, the unconventional leather jacket-wearing mother, whose story was turned into an Oscar-nominated film, whose son's remarkable life was immortalized on the big screen for the world to see. She was supposed to sit back, maybe cry a little in interviews, thank Cher for her performance, and let the machine do what machines do. But Rusty Dennis was never anybody's idea of a grateful woman. Before she died in November of 2006, Florence Rusty Tullis, that was her legal name by then, said things about her son Rocky, about that famous film, about the night he died, and about the life she had lived that the entertainment industry absolutely was not prepared for. She didn't burn it all down with rage. She did something far more unsettling. She told the truth. Her truth. Plainly, without apology, and without the slightest interest in making anyone comfortable. And when you hear what she actually said, not the cleaned-up version, not the Hollywood press tour version, you start to understand why the real story of Rocky Dennis is so much more complicated, so much more human, and so much more important than the movie ever let on. Today, we are going inside that truth. Who Rusty Dennis really was. What she said about the film that made her famous. What happened on the night her son died, and what she said about it. And what her final years, her final words, and her death on a motorcycle at 7 years old tell us about a woman the world only ever thought it knew. Stay with me, because this one does not end the way you think. Before we can talk about what Rusty said, we have to talk about who Rocky was. Not the movie version, the real one. Roy Lee Dennis was born on December 4th, 1961, in Glendora, California. He got his nickname, Rocky, because as an infant he would only fall asleep if someone rocked him. His mother was Florence Tullis, who everyone called Rusty. His father was Roy Dennis, her second husband. From the outside, in those first couple of years, life looked ordinary enough. A California family. A young boy with a mother who already had one son, Joshua, from a previous marriage. Then Rocky got sick. Ear infections. Sinus problems. The kind of recurring illnesses that make parents tired and worried, but not necessarily alarmed. So when Rocky was around 2 years old, a tonsillectomy was scheduled. Routine procedure. Nothing to lose sleep over. Except during the preoperative x-rays, the radiologists saw something that stopped everyone in the room cold. Something was wrong with the boy's skull. Not wrong in a minor way. Wrong in a way that sent the family to UCLA Medical Center for nearly a full year of visits, multiple times per week, before a diagnosis finally came back. Craniodiaphyseal dysplasia. Most people have never heard of it. In 1964 and 1965, when Rocky was first being evaluated, most doctors had never seen it either. At the time of his diagnosis, medical literature recorded only a handful of confirmed cases in the entire world. The condition causes the body to deposit calcium abnormally and excessively in the bones of the skull. Those bones thicken. They expand. They press outward and inward simultaneously, distorting the face, narrowing the passages through which nerves travel, slowly compressing the brain itself. Vision deteriorates. Hearing deteriorates. Neurological function deteriorates. And it does not stop. The doctors at UCLA sat Rusty down and gave her the prognosis without softening it. Her son would almost certainly lose his sight. He would likely suffer intellectual decline. And he would, in all medical probability, be dead before his 7th birthday. Dead before 7. Rusty Dennis heard that sentence. She understood it. And then she went home and raised her son like they hadn't said it. Here is the thing about Rusty Dennis that every profile, every interview, and yes, every movie gets partially wrong. She was not a mess who somehow found her way to being a good mother. She was not a cautionary tale with a redemptive arc. She was a fully formed, philosophically consistent, deeply unconventional human being who happened to love her son with an intensity that most conventional people cannot manufacture. Florence Rusty Tullis was born on May 29, 1936, in Brooklyn, New York. Her father drove trucks. She was Jewish, Brooklyn-born, and sharp in the way that certain New York women are sharp, like a knife that doesn't apologize for being a knife. She was kicked out of junior high school before she turned 14. By 15, she had dropped out of school entirely and was working as a dancer at Coney Island. She was not old enough to drive a car. At 17, she married a truck driver named Tommy Mason. Their son Joshua was born not long after. That marriage ended. She moved back in with her parents, then eventually found her way to California, where she married her second husband, Roy Dennis. And in 1961, Rocky arrived. By the time Rocky's diagnosis came down, Rusty had already built her entire personal worldview around single conviction, that the human mind has more power over the body than medicine is willing to admit. She had decided, somewhere in her own difficult early years, that if a person could think themselves into being sick, they could also think themselves into being well. This was not a casual belief. This was her religion. She raised Rocky inside that religion. When he had headaches, and he had them constantly because the disease pressed relentlessly against the structures of his skull, she would tell him to go to his room and make himself well. When pain flared, she did not reach first for medication or for the phone to call the doctor. She reached first for the belief that Rocky could manage it himself, that he was stronger than the disease, that thinking of himself as a victim would be the real thing that killed him. Was she right? In some ways, yes, remarkably. Rocky Dennis lived to be 16, nearly 17 years old. He was supposed to die at 6. He attended mainstream schools. He tutored his classmates. He memorized constellations. He fell in love at summer camp. He asked his surgeon, when surgery to alter his facial features was proposed, a question that stopped the room. Who will I see in the mirror if I change my face? And then he chose to keep his face. That is not the outcome of a boy who was raised to see himself as dying. But Rusty's philosophy had a shadow, and she knew it, and she never fully stepped out of that shadow. We will get to the night Rocky died. And when we do, that shadow matters. She was also, and this cannot be omitted, a full member of a motorcycle gang called the Turks. Not a hanger-on. Not a girlfriend who rode along. A member. The Turks were not weekend bikers with expensive gear and suburban homes to return to. They were rough-living, hard-loving people for whom loyalty was the highest currency. And they adored Rocky. They treated him not as something fragile or pitiable, but as one of their own. He was teased, included, argued with, and loved, the same way anyone in that circle was teased, included, argued with, and loved. Rusty also used drugs. She was direct about this in ways the movie was not. The film Mask, which we are about to get into, implies that her drug use was born from pain and exhaustion, a woman overwhelmed by circumstance reaching for relief. Rusty rejected that framing explicitly. In interviews, she described herself as someone who partied because she liked to party and who used drugs because drugs were part of the lifestyle she had chosen and enjoyed. That distinction mattered enormously to her. She was not a victim of her own habits. She had chosen them, and she owned them. This is the woman who raised Rocky Dennis. Not a flawed saint slowly finding redemption. A fully realized, philosophically grounded, stubbornly unconventional human being who happened, against all odds, to be exactly what her son needed. In 1985, Mask opened in theaters across America. Directed by Peter Bogdanovich. Starring Cher as Rusty Dennis and Eric Stoltz as Rocky. The film was a commercial and critical success. It earned Cher a Best Actress award at the Cannes Film Festival, and it lodged itself into the cultural memory of an entire generation as one of the defining inspirational films of the decade. And Rusty Dennis was paid $15,000 for the rights to her and her son's life story. $15,000. The film grossed more than $48 million at the box office. The woman whose dead son's life, whose own unconventional choices, whose entire family's struggle formed the raw material of that story, received $15,000. And most of that money did not go to her. According to multiple contemporaneous accounts, the majority of what she received went directly toward medical bills for her older son Joshua, who was at that time fighting AIDS. She did not sell Rocky's story to profit from it. She sold it to try to keep her other child alive. When reporters and interviewers came calling after the film's release, expecting Rusty Dennis to perform the role of grateful, overwhelmed mother, finally seen, finally heard, finally validated, they found something else entirely. She called the film a fairy tale. Not a tribute, not a beautiful memorial. A fairy tale. Those were her words, and she said them in interviews in 1985 and 1986 without apparent concern for how they landed. She told the Chicago Tribune that she had imagined making a film about Rocky's courage and what it could mean for disabled children and their families. She had not imagined a film that made her into a protagonist. She had not gone into the deal expecting to emerge as a complicated anti-heroine played by one of the most famous women in the world. But here is the nuance that gets lost when people talk about Rusty's feelings toward the film. She was not entirely unhappy with it. Her comments about Cher's portrayal were genuinely warm. She told interviewers that Cher had depicted her very well, that she had always considered herself perfectly normal, and that the film captured something true about the way she saw the world. She even delivered what is perhaps the most accurate self-description of her life in a single sentence: "I always thought I was perfectly normal. The rest of the world is nuts." That is not a woman who hated the movie. That is a woman who saw herself in it, appreciated the performance, but refused to surrender her own understanding of who the story was actually about. For Rusty, it had always been about Rocky. The film split the spotlight in ways she had not expected and had not entirely consented to. She also named two specific departures from reality that she found significant. The first was the film's compression of time. Events that unfolded across many years were collapsed into what appears on screen to be roughly 12 months. This is standard Hollywood practice, and Rusty acknowledged it without outrage. The second departure bothered her more. Her older son Joshua was written out of the film entirely. He does not appear. He is not mentioned. For a woman who had two sons and who would eventually lose both of them, the erasure of Joshua from Rocky's story felt like an erasure of part of her own. And then there was the music. Rocky Dennis loved Bruce Springsteen. This is not a detail or a footnote. Rocky loved Springsteen deeply and specifically, and director Peter Bogdanovich built the film's original soundtrack around that love. He secured the rights to Springsteen's songs and scored the film accordingly. Then Universal Pictures, without informing Bogdanovich, swapped the Springsteen catalog for songs by Bob Seger. When Rusty Dennis heard what had been done, she appeared on a San Francisco talk show called People Are Talking in 1985 and said the following about the musical substitution: that she did not think Rocky even knew who Bob Seger was. 7 words: precise, devastating, and completely unanswerable. Bogdanovich was so enraged by what Universal had done that he sued the studio for $19 million, arguing the swap violated his contractual right to final cut. He eventually won, in the sense that Springsteen's music was restored for the director's cut DVD release in 2004, nearly 20 years after the film originally opened. But the version most people saw, most people remember, and most people quote, that version had the wrong music. Rocky Dennis's story was told with the wrong soundtrack. And his mother said so clearly, at the first opportunity she was given. By the autumn of 1978, Rocky Dennis was 16 years old, and the disease that should have taken him at 6 was finally, irrevocably winning. He had outlived the death sentence his doctors handed down by nearly a decade. He had done it through some combination of medicine, luck, his mother's iron conviction, and whatever internal resource he had cultivated by being raised to believe he was stronger than his own body. But by September and early October of 1978, he was in a wheelchair. The headaches that had been his constant companions his entire life had escalated past the point where anything could meaningfully touch them. In early October, the family went out to dinner together, Rocky, Rusty, and the members of the biker circle that had been Rocky's extended family his whole life. Everyone at that table could see what was happening. The boy who had charmed them, infuriated them, been tutored and teased and loved by them for 16 years, was fading in front of them. That evening, Rocky came home with a headache. And Rusty Dennis did what she had done his entire life. She sent him to his room and told him to make himself well. He never woke up. Rocky Dennis died in his sleep, at home, on October 4, 1978. He was 16 years old, and just weeks away from turning 17. His passing was not in a hospital. There were no machines. There was no clinical setting. There was only home and sleep, and then nothing. Now here is what the movie shows: Rusty discovering his body herself. It is one of the film's rawest and most emotionally devastating scenes, and it serves the narrative perfectly. The mother who has fought so ferociously, finally confronted with the one fight she could not win. Here is what actually happened. Rusty was not at home when Rocky died. She was at her attorney's office, dealing with a drug possession charge. Her partner, a man named Bernie Tullis, the real person on whom the film's character Gar, played by Sam Elliott, was based, called her with the news. There is no version of that gap between movie and reality that makes Rusty Dennis a bad mother. She had spent 16 years fighting for a child the medical establishment had already written off. The fact that she was handling a legal matter on one ordinary morning does not undo any of that. But Hollywood, true to form, smoothed it. They gave her a scene of grief that was cinematic and immediate and present. The reality was a phone call, a voice telling her, the moment landing from a distance. And what did Rusty say about sending Rocky to his room that night? She never took it back. In interviews before her death, she never described that moment as a failure. She never framed it as guilt she carried. She never said she should have done otherwise. She said she believed in what she had done, that it was consistent with how she had raised him his entire life, and that raising him with that belief was, she was convinced, part of what had given him 16 years, instead of 6. Whether you find that remarkable or troubling or both, whether you see a mother who gave her son extraordinary resilience or a mother whose philosophy, meant as pain, was sometimes met with a command rather than comfort, is something only you can decide. What is certain is that Rusty Dennis decided, and she did not undecide. Not publicly, not to the press, not in the accounts that have survived her. She said Rocky's death was just another place to go, and he loved going places. That is a sentence that will mean something different to every single person who reads it. It is the sentence of a woman who had long ago made peace with impermanence in a way that most of us never do, and it is also the sentence of a woman who may have needed that peace more than anyone should. There is a name that should appear in the story of Rocky Dennis, and almost never does. That name is Joshua. Joshua Mason was Rusty's first son, born from her first marriage to a truck driver named Tommy Mason. He was Rocky's older brother. He was a real and present person in both Rocky's life and Rusty's, and he was excised from the film mask as though he had never existed. Rusty talked about this. Not with rage, more with the specific, quiet register of someone noting an absence that they feel in the bones. By 1985, when Mask was released, Joshua was living in San Francisco. He was a writer. He was openly gay. And he had just been diagnosed with Kaposi sarcoma, the cancer that, in the mid-1980s, was one of the most visible and devastating markers of AIDS. The AIDS crisis was at its most acute and most terrifying, and Joshua was inside it.